Good afternoon. I'll try this again. Good afternoon. Is the microphone on? No. Good afternoon. It worked. I'm still Steve Ehrman, which is always a pleasure. You know, when you get to a certain age, it's called discovery. I wanted to start this afternoon by thanking in a little bit more detail the people who put in so much to make this event succeed. There are way too many to mention by name, but at least I can mention them by groups. There was a team of faculty who put together the speakers and then sort of brought this wonderful pair of speakers to us as a kind of a gift and said, we think the Office of Teaching and Learning should sponsor this. Yes, we brilliantly said that would be a good idea. The Teaching Learning Collaborative staff who worked on this with able, active, and persistent help from academic technologies. We have a faculty advisory committee now to the Office of Teaching and Learning who did a lot of work in spreading the word about this event, and we eventually shut off registrations at about 300, figuring that we didn't want to take any chances with people not being able to get seats. The Provost's office provided both financial support and a lot of logistical help in planning the event. Their staff in the auditorium who worked on just general logistics and AV, external relations, was very helpful, and of course GW Today, among others, covering the story, and 21st Century Visions, which is doing the webcast of this event. I was commenting to some of the folks yesterday that I've been a guest speaker myself a number of times and have just sort of seen the tip of the iceberg, and it's quite intimidating to see just how much work is involved in doing something like this. I'm tempted to say we should never do anything like this again, just because it takes so much time from so many people to pull off something like this, but I'm really glad that they did, and I hope you are too. If you could put up my slides, and then I will pivot around a little bit because I realized I'm looking this way and my speaking notes are behind me. I wanted to begin by just taking a minute or two to introduce myself. If we can go to the next slide. Somewhere around here, there's a little clicker here. I wonder how this works. I think, yeah, there we go. So that's my little bio. I'm not going to read it to you, but I just wanted you to know I've come here from somewhere. And that's what the provost asked us to do in the Office of Teaching and Learning. It's pretty simple to help create a climate at the institution where no matter how well you teach, you think it would be rewarding and perhaps even rewarded if I taught even better. And if that doesn't seem radical, then you haven't been talking to the same faculty that I've been talking to, because quite a few of them have been telling me it really matters in a negative way if you're a bad teacher, but when you get to be adequate or so, then nobody really cares that much whether you go higher. And I wouldn't say that every faculty member at the institution would say that, but I'm a fairly new fellow, and I've heard it from a lot of junior and senior faculty. So that sort of sketches out part of the agenda. The other part, of course, is giving people the means to do that, and hopefully to save some time in the process. And I'll get back to that issue in a minute. There we go. I thought as I was trying to encapsulate something of that long experience that you saw, what lessons are sort of inescapably with me, in that I feel almost, not quite, religious about these ideas as guidelines for how to help faculty who are interested in working to improve teaching. This is a little diagram representing a study that Roxanne Hiltz did in the mid-1980s, right at the very beginning of online learning. Roxanne, by the way, was the woman who coined the term virtual classroom. And she was just looking at two sections of a single composition course, not a very big N at all. The students in the computer conferencing section had to write an essay at the end of the term, as well as the students who were in the on-campus course. And then at the end of the term, they had to write another essay, similar kind of content. So the investigators took these 4 stacks of essays, mixed them all up, coding them, of course, so they'd know which was which, and gave them to some outsiders and said, here was the purpose of the assignment, please grade these assignments. And the question that they were interested in, of course, was who gained more, who learned more about writing, the students who were in the on-campus course or the students who were in the online course. I will pause for the dramatic 3 seconds so that you can come up with your own prediction of what was found. And my suspicion is if you teach writing, you already know. The answer was that represents 4 stacks of papers, in effect, each with an average grade at the top, 2 pre, 2 post, 2 on campus, 2 online. All 4 stacks of papers got the same grade. There was not only no difference between online and on campus, there was no difference between the end of the semester and the beginning of the semester in terms of the quality of writing. This turns out to be pretty typical in writing courses, and I suspect if anybody in any discipline chose any capability that they want their graduates to have mastered, and then say in what courses was that capability taught, and could we come up with a way from the beginning of the term to the end of the term of a single course to say, did that capability get better in a meaningful and lasting way? The answer might well be no. And that doesn't mean that they didn't learn the capability during the degree program. I was talking to a student, in fact, I will go to this next slide here. I was talking to a student at Reed as part of a little investigation. I mean, really little. It was 1 day of interviews. And what we were talking about in part was how students think differently when they rewrite their work. And this was, again, in the mid to late 80s, so word processing was a hot new technology at that time. All the students at Reed had word processors, and it was really, he was a senior, and it was the first senior class that had had computers since they were freshmen. So he'd been writing with a computer since he was a freshman. And when I asked him what effect this had had on his capabilities, he said, well, when I got here, I thought you just write a paper once. You start with the first word, you go to the last word, and then you're done. You turn it in. You go on to the next assignment. He said, now I just keep rewriting and rewriting and rewriting until either I feel that I've done or I've run out of time, and then I turn it in. And I said, what class did you learn that in? And there's his answer. So this is sort of the first thing that I bring to my work here. And I know that it's not the same as maybe what a lot of teaching learning center and offices of teaching and learning believe, which often focuses on, how can we redesign a course, or perhaps how do we redesign an assignment here and an assignment over there. I really think, although the work of academics is always in the moment, the student's moment, the faculty's moment, if you're talking about numbers of students and you're talking about improving learning in a way that people can actually see, you're talking about things that changes that have to be pervasive. They may not be dramatic in the moment, but they have to be pervasive and cumulative to have a better than usual shot at being able to see that you've actually done something. 2 clicks. Okay, here's the second and last little piece of research that I want to allude to. Actually, by an unfortunate coincidence, the author of this study was here this morning but couldn't be here this afternoon. Carol Schneider from the Association of American Colleges and Universities did this study when she was at the University of Chicago. The question that was being asked here is, how do excellent teachers think differently about the activity of teaching than average teachers do? And the URL is there, and by the way, that's case sensitive, so if you want to look at it, be sure that it's a capital B and that it's a hyphen, not an underscore, and a capital A, and you'll get the study. But basically, what they did, and it was just for 4 programs at 4 different institutions, students, faculty, and administrators were shown a list of the faculty in that particular program, and they were asked, who are the superlative teachers in this program? Actually, the first question was, whose teaching are you familiar with? Put a check mark beside those names. And if you think the person is a superlative teacher, walk on water, one of the best ever, put a second check mark beside their name. So that gave the research team, they used that information to create 2 groups of faculty, one of whom had gotten almost all double checks, and the other group had gotten almost all single checks. So nobody said they were bad. Almost nobody said that they were superlative, walk on water, one of the very best that we've got. And the question was, through interviews that asked faculty to tell stories essentially about times when they'd felt effective, and to tell stories about times when they'd felt ineffective and frustrated as teachers, to see whether there was any difference in the way the two groups of faculty thought about the activity of teaching. And they had some nice ways of testing their theories. It wasn't just totally inductive from the one group. And again, you can find out more about the methodology if you want. So again, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 seconds just to think about, what do you think? What do you think they found? There it is. The normal faculty on the left, the superlative faculty on the right. And in case you weren't here this morning, I'll tell you that Carl Wyman is on the right. The talk this morning was all about thinking that way. And I think one of the reasons why it's hard to get pervasive change is there are a lot of faculty, at least so people tell me, on the left. The study that I'm reporting on here was done in 1981, and I've had a lot of chances since then to tell people at different institutions about this, and I'd say, well, of course nobody knows how people at this institution think about teaching, but what percentage, you're just guessing, and nobody's ever going to say you're wrong. What's your guess about, at this particular college or university, what percentage of your faculty are on the left and what percentage of your faculty are on the right? And in all the times that I've ever asked that question, I think one person has said 50-50 or better towards the right. The general answer is a majority, not 90%, but 60, 70, 80% are on the left and the remainder are on the right. Again, you may have different answers, and your answer is as valid as anybody else's. It's all just guesswork. But given that conviction that I've got that in the end, it's cumulatively what happens to students. One of the things that's going to be a great concern to the Office of Teaching and Learning is if you've got faculty whose beliefs are on the left, and I want to say that I'm not talking about skills or enthusiasms, or are they good teachers or bad teachers. It's just, that's what they believe. It's my job to do this. I really don't think I can do any more than putting it out there. It's really up to the students to do it. Are there any things that one can do that begin to say, well, maybe there's another way of looking at it. Maybe you can be better than you think. Maybe you can do better than you think. And again, that's part of what Wyman was talking about this morning. Examples of faculty who perhaps felt at the beginning, I'm doing the best I can, I'm pretty good, I don't see anybody could do any better, changed methods, and no, we're not just talking in the courses he was looking at a little change, we're talking about a huge change in what students were learning. And word of that might spread. So I come out of this thinking one thing that's kind of encouraging. The provost mentioned this morning, I think too, that an institution can be great in research and great in teaching, and undergraduate research being stressed in part because it's sort of at the intersect there. But I think more generally that really good teaching, and again I point to that group of faculty that Carol looked at, is characterized in a way by research. And I won't say it's rigorous research, because it really was, I try something and then I watch to see what happens. And I'm paying attention not to the average of all students, I'm trying as much as I can to pay attention to each student. I talked with one of the Bender winners yesterday who expressed the same sort of thing. It's really important to me, she said, to understand what's going on inside my students' heads. And I don't think she meant on the average. She was talking about how she graded papers one after the other and trying to understand whether students individually were making progress. And I have a sense that the way she thought, the way a lot of the Bender winners think, is I try something, I watch, I see what's working for some people, I see where other people may not be going, and I think, well, what can I do for them to get even more students ignited and going forward? But the other thing, again, putting those two stories together, is the importance of faculty working together on these things. Remember those faculty, I think often about writing in the disciplines as an example of this. It's hard enough when a composition faculty member, full-time faculty member, teaches for a term, can't tell at the end of the term whether the students are any better at writing. I really have feelings for the writing in the disciplines faculty member who's really trying to teach mainly something else and is also on the side trying to help students write better. and almost guaranteed that they're not, in sort of any basic terms, going to be able to see at the end of the semester, are my students writing better? So what do you do? How do you keep your spirits up in that kind of situation? And maybe part of the answer is, well, you work together. Instead of focusing just on did students learn in this course, you look at a number of courses and say, by the time they got to the end of that group of courses, were they learning what we wanted them to learn? And that way, I think you can begin to close the loop a little bit, as they say in the trade, and get information that you can use that might either confirm, yes, we're really heading in the right direction, even though by ourselves we can't tell, or contrariwise, well, gee, it's not really adding up to what we want it to add up to. Maybe as a group, we better rethink a little bit what we're doing. One advantage of that, by the way, I hear from folks talking about student ratings of faculty. If a number of faculty are changing their teaching in similar ways, it's less likely that students will say to the lonely pioneer, you're the only one who's making me do this. You're not legitimate, you're not normal. I want to keep on going the comfortable way that I've been going with other folks. It's a thought. So I say all this because the speakers today, this morning and this afternoon, are talking about pretty serious challenges to higher education. And whether you believe all of them or not, I think most people would say that there are some significant ways in which we need to get better. I think we can get better. I think it takes patience and persistence. It could easily take a decade to do the kinds of changes that we're talking about, but you do a little bit every year, you get a little bit better. And I think there's a lot of room to grow in that respect. So I think when we hear these things, it doesn't necessarily need to be a situation of, oh, they're saying that things are terrible, but I can't do anything about that, so I would rather believe that they're wrong. I think, we could do something about these things. Oops, wrong button. There we go. And I'll just say one of the things that's going on with the provost talked a lot this morning about the things we're planning on doing and have begun to do in the office. The faculty advisory committee, coordinated by Rahul Simha, is already doing great work. They've organized themselves into 4 task forces, and there they are. So that'll give you a little bit of a sense of some of the issues that are being worked on first there. And now I get to this slide, which is the best one. Our speaker this afternoon, Josipa Roksa, is from the University of Virginia, co-author of Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses, and you can read the slide there. And I think it's particularly nice that she is a university teaching fellow and Meade honored faculty at the University of Virginia. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Josipa. Thank you for coming here.
Welcome, and in particular, welcome to the afternoon session. I know after lunch, nobody wants to teach at 1 o'clock, right? And so this is a hard act to follow. Everybody's ready to go home, but I'm going to hopefully give you something to think about and wake you up and help you keep focused. The project I'm going to talk about today is based on Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses. It is a work that Richard Aram at NYU and I have done over the last few years. Now, we are traveling and we are talking and we are the ones who wrote the book, but really an effort of this scale is something that requires lots of people's assistance. So we have worked with a number of graduate students. We have collaborated closely with the Council for Aid to Education that developed the instrument we are using, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. We've also received funding from Carnegie, Teagle, Ford, and Lumina over the years to actually support this endeavor. So while I'm here today talking about it, it's important to keep in mind that there's actually a lot going on and a lot of people were involved in the process. In addition to people who actually facilitated the research, of course, the 24 institutions that participated and all of the students who took part were also crucial, because without them, we'd never have these results. So I'm going to talk primarily about the findings from the book. Now, the book covers the first 2 years of college. And all of you are academics, so you know that academic press takes forever. And so by the time that the book came out, we actually had students graduated from college, and they were in the labor market by that point in time. So we have actually followed the students since, so we know what has happened to them throughout their college careers, and we have followed them into the labor market and kind of transitions afterwards. They're now 2 years out, 2 years after college graduation. We have just talked to them recently, and so if I have time at the end, I'll give you a little bit of an update in terms of what they look like today. Because part of what we are concerned about, right, is how much what we do while they're with us in higher education matters for what happens afterwards in their careers. Now, this started as a regular social science research project, and so it started with a series of questions that we were interested in. The first question was a very basic question about basically how much are students improving critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. Now, we're not claiming that this is the only set of skills that college is about, that this is what all, this is all that students learn. They're obviously learning science. They're obviously learning substantive, things in their courses. They may be developing leadership skills. They may be doing a whole lot of things in college. But we think this is an important set of skills to develop. Okay? Most university mission statements make claims related to critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing. And it's something that we often think that all college students should be able to do, right? So maybe physics majors should learn something very specific about physics, but we think that at the end of 4 years of college, right, what college should be about, that students should develop these general skills. And they should be better at the end than they are at the beginning. The question is really, is that the case? Now, in the past, we've oftentimes asked students this question. Okay, so when students are seniors, we do an exit survey, and we say, how much do you think you learned? And they all say they learned a great deal, right? Because after 4 years and $150,000, I mean, you'd think, you all think you're learning a lot. Well, the question is, can we actually verify that empirically? Carl Wyman this morning was talking a lot, can we demonstrate it? Can we actually empirically show what's happening and how much? The second question is, I'm a sociologist by training, as is Richard. Our primary concern was about different groups of students. So how do students from different family backgrounds, from different racial ethnic groups are faring? Okay? Based on K through 12 experiences, you may anticipate that they're going to enter behind. They're going to come into college with lower levels of skills. But the question is really what happens afterwards, right? Do they gain at the same rate? Do they gain less? Do they gain more? What happens over time with different groups of students? And then perhaps particularly for the audience here, the question is, what can we do, right? Are there specific contexts, specific experiences, specific things students can do and we can do to actually improve their learning? And as I said, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about what happens after they leave. So if you had these sets of questions and you wanted to ask them in K through 12, you'd have a fairly easy time because there are large national data sets that track students in K through 12, usually starting even before they enter school, through their high school careers. And give them tests, usually math and reading, sometimes other subjects, and you can really see how much are they learning, which groups are learning more or less, what kinds of classrooms or teachers may be associated with more or less learning, all of that stuff. Well, once students enter higher education, we all of a sudden stop testing them. We only follow them to see if they graduated. Right? Did they persist to graduate? And so if you want to know answers to these questions, you actually don't have an existing data set to go to. And so we tried to put one together over the last few years. One important thing is that it is a longitudinal design study. So what happens is students entered college in fall 2005. That's the first time they were tested. They were given the collegiate learning assessment. I'm going to talk about it in a moment. They were asked a series of questions. And then those same students were followed 2 years later and 4 years later. Okay, end of their sophomore year, end of their senior year. Again, the book is in the first 2 years, 205, 207. We have 24 four-year institutions, about 2,400 students in that sample. They're all four-year institutions, but they are very different. Okay, so there are small schools and big schools, and more or less selective, publics, privates, all four regions of the country. The sample actually reasonably well represents what higher education in the U.S. looks like today. We asked students a series of questions about their backgrounds, their high school experiences, about their college experiences, and then they were given something called the collegiate learning assessment. Okay, this is the assessment that we're going to use to talk about the skills, critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. Okay. Many of you may know about the CLA, but if you don't, right, the one thing that's important, it is a direct measure of learning, right? We're not asking students how much they think they learn. We're actually trying to measure it. It's not a multiple choice test. Now, we think that's important for validity purposes in terms of what we think we are measuring. We're trying to measure this very complex set of skills, right? Critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing. The question is, what's the best way to do that? And then the way the CLA works is that students are presented with a scenario, okay? A scenario that they may find themselves in after they graduate. So the idea is to present them with a case of what they may face after graduation and to see how well they can do in that kind of a real-world scenario. And it's a holistic assessment in a sense that the skills of critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing are skills that go together, right, and kind of work together. It's very difficult to parse them out. And so what happens is students get a scenario, and this is just one example. They range from natural science, social science, humanities. They go across different fields and different areas. And so students come in. Everything's on a computer. They come in, and they get a scenario. And this is one scenario where it basically says you are an assistant to the mayor. And this year, the big debate is about crime rates. Right? That's the debate, that's the discussion. And the mayor you're working for is arguing that to reduce the crime rates, what you need to do is you need to increase the police force. Well, the opponent is saying, that's not a very good strategy. That's not how you do it. If you want to deal with crime rates, what you need to do is you need to deal with drugs, because drugs are the major cause of crime. And so if you deal with drugs, you're going to deal with crime, right? So kind of two different interpretations, two different stories, two different arguments. So students get, a more elaborate, this is a summary of the scenario, but they get a more elaborate scenario that conveys some kind of a dilemma, some kind of a question, some kind of a situation in which a decision needs to be made. And then what happens is that they get 5 or 6 documents that are relevant to the scenario. So they could get some crime statistics, some relationships between crime and drugs. They could get some evaluations of drug treatment programs, some internal memos. And so they get information that's relevant to the scenario they're dealing with. Okay. So the task, students have 90 minutes. Okay. And their task is to read those documents, okay, to analyze them, to think through them. Okay, to decide what's important, what's relevant, what's, to evaluate that evidence, also kind of what's the stronger evidence in those articles and pieces they're given. And then to think through it, analyze, synthesize, and write an argument. Okay, and they're usually given some kind of a specific question, so it's not just write an argument, but they're given kind of specific prompts. But so the idea is, right, that they're going to analyze, synthesize that information. They're going to write an essay in response to that scenario. That essay is going to be graded, and a score on that essay is what I'm talking about when I talk about critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. Okay? So and we can talk later in terms of what you think of that, but I just want to make sure that that's what it is, right? So when I say critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing, I'm talking about a score that's based on an essay that students write to a prompt like this. Okay, this is actually what's happened. So that's all the background, or at least in a few minutes of a background. But the next few slides are probably the most important, and they actually aren't based on a CLA. They're based on student responses. Okay? So students did take the CLA, and they took it when they first came into college, end of their sophomore year, end of their senior year. But we also just asked them things about their college experiences. And one thing we asked them, you probably can't read the bottom, but I'll tell you what it is. Just look at the height of the bars. We asked them, how many courses, okay, so think about it. So this is sophomore year, spring semester. We said, think back to the previous semester and tell us how many courses did you take in which you had to write more than 20 pages all semester long. Okay, so not one big 20-page paper, but 20 pages, all semester long. So we asked how many, because we thought it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, there were so many zeros that what you're seeing here is just a 0, 1. Did you take any or not? Okay, so it's not how many, it's did you at all. Okay, so we have 50% of the students saying the previous semester I have not taken one single course in which I had to write 20 pages all semester long. And then we asked them about reading. And we said, OK, how many courses, again, social scientists, we're professors, right? So we think everybody reads and writes. And so we asked them, how many courses did you take in which you had to read more than 40 pages a week? Now, we didn't think that was a lot. And a third of the students came back and said, none. Not I didn't take 3, 4, 5 classes like that. I haven't taken a single class in which I had to read more than 40 pages a week. The corner there is probably the most depressing. There's about 25% of the students who are not getting either of those experiences. They're saying that I've not taken a course the previous semester that has either of those 2 requirements at all. Okay? And so, large numbers of students are making it through higher education today without doing a great deal of reading and writing. They're managing to find courses, they're managing to find programs, they're managing to find their way through the higher education system without doing a lot of reading and writing. Now, if they're not reading and writing, you may wonder, well, what are they doing? Yeah, we probably know what they're doing, right? They're doing a lot of different kinds of things, but they're not reading and writing, that's for sure. So this is converted into percentages, but I should tell you. So students say that they spend 15 hours a week in class and lab. That's about, right, they're usually taking 15, 16 credits. Now, that's, of course, assuming they actually go to every class and lab. And those of you who teach large lectures know that that's not the case. But, at least technically, right, let's give them 15 hours a week is spent in classes and labs. And then the second part of the pie, the 7%, that's 12 hours. That's how much full-time, traditional-age college students spend studying. Okay? If you ask them how many hours a week they spend studying, it's about 12 hours a week. So that's basically 16% of their time in a week is spent on academic pursuits, if you wish, either studying or actually being in class. Now, out of the 12 hours, a third of it is actually spent studying with peers. And I'm going to show you later that's not really studying. So if you get rid of that, students are spending only 8 to 9 hours studying alone. And now even that's a question because nobody's alone today. Right? We always got our iPods and iPhones and Facebook and everything else going. But 8 to 9 hours of studying alone for a full-time, traditional-age college student today. Well, one thing you can say is, well, why are you making a big fuss over this? Because college was never about academics anyways, right? College was always a place to have a great time, to learn about yourself, to meet people. It's the best years of your life, right? So this is how it's always been. Well, maybe it has, but maybe it hasn't. Okay. This is one slide that's not from our research. It's actually based on research by, by Philip Babcock and Mindy Marks. You can find it on their website. What they did was, they looked at all the time use surveys that we have in the US over the course of the century. It actually started in the 1920s. And they've looked at how many hours full-time college students spend studying, report spending studying in these different surveys. And basically, from the 1920s to the 1960s, it's kind of flat. It's about 25 hours studying, and then they're spending about 15 hours in class and lab, right? So that adds up to, well, a full-time college student. Well, something happens in the 60s, okay, where we can figure out what happened in the 60s, but something happened in the 60s, and we haven't recovered because we keep slipping, okay? So in the 1960s, right, we started this downward fall, basically, that we go from about 25 hours studying to about 12 to 13 hours studying today, which is what we reported in our study as well. Okay. So what it means to be a full-time college student in terms of how much time students spend studying has dropped in half. Okay. It's about half today what it was in the 1960s. Now, that's across all majors, across all groups, across all places. It's not like there's one group that's driving this. It's actually seems to be happening across the board. At the same time that this is happening, right, that the amount of time that a full-time college student spends studying drops dramatically, their expectations skyrocket. Okay? So there's a survey that I should probably make a slide about. It's Harry at UCLA. So they ask students during orientation, right? So students just came to campus. They haven't even taken classes yet. They're just excited. They ask them what kind of grades they think they're going to get. Yeah. So in 1971 was the first time they asked that question. And in 1971, only like 27% brave souls said, I'm going to get a B or higher in college. I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to get a B or higher in college. Today, more than 2/3 say, I'm going to be a B or higher in college. Right? So how much time they invest has dropped in half, and the expectations have doubled in terms of what they're going to get. Now, and I should say that we don't disappoint. Okay. I'm a faculty member, so I can say it, right? So we have students, so yeah, I told you the average hour studying. Well, in our sample, there's about 1/3 of the students, about 36%, that say that they study 5 or fewer hours a week alone. Okay, 5 or fewer hours a week. And you may think, oh, these are students who are on academic probation, and they're really struggling. They're not going to do too well. They're barely kind of scraping by. Well, we have their transcripts. And the GPA of those students who are self-reporting that they're studying 5 or fewer hours a week alone is 3.2. So, they have high expectations. They're going to get very good grades for doing very little work. And we seem to very much support that and make sure that's how it happens. So now that, you've been with me so far, this is not a shocking slide, even though initially, when the media kind of took on the book, part of it, this was kind of the shocking slides or the shocking statistics about what the average growth is and how many students seem to be showing no gains over the first 2 years, but over the whole 4 years of college as well. And so we find that 36% of the students are showing no significant gains on the CLA measure over the 4 years of college. Now, it's a very descriptive statistic, and what I mean by significant gain is if you had a 100-point scale, so CLA is on a different scale, but if you turned it into a 100 scale, if students gained 1 point, we would say they gained significantly. Okay. So these 36% have not moved 1 point in 4 years of college. Okay. If you were here this morning, maybe it shouldn't be surprising, right? All these students are going backwards on learning physics. But we're not doing much better when it comes to critical thinking, computation, and writing either. So it's something we should really think about and consider as we go forward. Now, these are the averages. Okay? And if I have any scientists in here, they're going to say, well, around every average, there's lots of variation. Right? So what does the variation look like? How much variation is there? And can we use that variation to learn something? Okay. Can we figure out, are there any students that are gaining? And where are they? And who are they? And what are they doing? Right? So what we do is we end up doing lots of regression models in which we are trying to predict gains over time. We are controlling for all the student characteristics. So their SAT scores, AP classes, family background, race, ethnicity, high schools they came from. Everything we had in our data to try to kind of eliminate those differences which they brought into college. And these are some of the things that matter, right? So I'm going to highlight only a few that turn out to be significant once we control for everything else that we have. One is, faculty expectations. Okay. When students say that faculty have high expectations of students like me, they show significantly higher gains than when they don't report faculty having high expectations. And again, this is net of students as AP courses and SAT scores and a series of other things. So faculty seems to play an important role in terms of what we say we expect and how we guide their learning. Those reading and writing requirements, as modest as they may be, the 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester and more than 40 pages of reading each week, they make a difference. Right? If students say that they've taken a course the previous semester in which they had those requirements, right, this shows significantly higher gain than they do if they don't take those courses. I think the important part is that the black bar is the one that stands out, right? You need both. You need reading and writing, right? You need to kind of do both of them in order to show improvement, at least on a measure such as the CLA. The other thing was students' time use. So we asked them about what they're doing with their time, not just studying, but all sorts of other things. So this is what turns out to matter. Okay, the straight line, or not the straight line, but the kind of full line, if you wish, trend went upwards. That's the amount of time they spend studying alone. Okay, so the more time they spend studying alone, the higher the gains on the CLA. Now, this would not be surprising, right? I mean, it's time on task. The more time you actually spend doing something, the better you get at it, supposedly, or that's what we would expect. Now, this other line is the one that we get lots of flack about, the studying with peers line, which, as you see, is negative, quite negative, actually, as negative as time spent in fraternities and sororities. So the more time students spend studying with peers, or the more time they spend in fraternities and sororities, the lower, they actually experience negative, right, returns. They actually experience losses. And so it's something that we've gotten lots of questions about, as you might think, because we've spent the last few decades in higher education talking about collaborative learning and talking about group work and talking about encouraging students to work together. And so I think what's important here is that this is not a question about specifically structured learning communities. It's not about specifically structured courses. It's not about anything that actually is specifically designed. It's simply asking students how many hours you spend studying and how many hours you spend studying with peers. It turns out that this studying with peers seems to be much more about socializing on other things than actually studying. But I think students think they're studying, right? And so that's part of it. What's important here is that they think they're studying, and it's not clear that that's what's happening. And we've encouraged that. We've encouraged them to go out and do it with peers, perhaps sometimes without providing proper guidance of how to actually use studying with peers in ways in which it could be productive and not look like they're spending time in fraternities and sororities. Then we looked at majors. And I think a number of faculty here are from arts and sciences, so you'll be pleased to know that traditional arts and science fields show significantly higher gains than other fields. So science and math, as well as social science and humanities, show the highest gains over time. On this end is business, education, and social work. Okay. Business education and social work show the lowest gains over time. And again, this is accounting for differences in student body characteristics across those fields. So one thing I want to also, so these are kind of averages and giving you some general sense, but the question that we started with was also about inequality, right? So what happens to inequality in higher education over time? In K-12, we've been worried about inequality for a while and trying to think about, how big are the gaps, where are they, where do they come from, how can we address them? Okay, so the higher education, here are the gaps in higher education. So this is, this is a MAC, which means that I don't have any of my anything on my axes, but I can explain what the figure is. So this is the joy of technology, right? You never know what's going to show up on a screen. But at least they're the bars, so I can tell you what the bars represent. Okay, so the black bar is students whose parents had a high school or less. Okay, and then the gray bar is students whose parents had a graduate and professional degrees. Because it's trying to look at differences between kind of the extremes of the parental education distribution. And what you can see is that in 2005, this is 2005, 2007, 2009. Okay, so we're tracking them over time. In 2005, there's a gap. Okay, it's not huge, but there's a slight gap. You might expect it, given the differences in K-12 experiences of these students. And so what happens over time is that that gap pretty much stays the same. Okay? So students from all family backgrounds seem to be learning at about the same rate. And so the gap with which they enter pretty much stays over time. Okay? So they kind of leave with the same kind of gap that they entered. Now, the patterns for race ethnicity are much more disturbing than this. Okay? So this is African Americans, is the black bar. The gray bar is whites. We look in a book at other racial ethnic groups, or Asians, Hispanics, but we're showing you here this one because this is the most stark, the one that requires, we believe, a lot of attention and hard thinking about. So this is 2005. Okay, this is the gap between African American and white students in 2005. Okay, the gap is huge. Okay, think back to the slide before compared to that gap. This gap is about 3 times the size of it. Okay, it's a huge gap at entry. Students from African American backgrounds enter, with substantially lower level of performance on the CLA in 205. And perhaps even more disturbing is what happens over time, right? Is that the gap widens. Okay. And the gap widens over time because African American students gain less than white students. Okay, it's particularly the case in the first 2 years, but actually holds over the whole 4 years. Okay, so huge gap to begin with African Americans showing lower gains over time. The gap widens by the end, so that students are leaving college, with a bigger gap than they actually came in with. Again, this is not actually surprising. If you look at K-12 literature, we've seen this, we've known this, we've had a national conversation about this, the black-white test score gap, right? Everybody knows about a black-white test score gap. But in higher education, we haven't had that conversation. And we think it's really time to have that conversation in higher education as well. Now, the other question you may say, and particularly for the administrators, well, how much do schools matter? Okay. Because one way to think about this is that, well, students are students. These different outcomes largely reflect what they come to college with, and schools can make very little difference. Well, the different ways of trying to think about this. One way is to say, if you look at growth, okay, this is the whole 4 years, but the 2 years looks the same. So if you look at how much growth students experience over the 4 years of college, and you look at that variation in that growth, how much of it is about schools and how much is about students? Okay, you can kind of separate it out, statistically at least. About 23% of the growth, okay, and so again, it's not a test score, it's growth, it's change over time, is about schools. Okay? Now what that says is that schools actually play a pretty substantial role in how much students improve over time or not. And if you look at individual institutions, it's very much the case. There's schools in which students show much more improvement than other schools, right? So you can see that very well in the data. Now, you may also say, well, but 75% basically, right? 3/4 of the gap is basically within schools. Okay? And we think this is a really important point. Okay? A colleague of ours at Wabash College who has a similar study to this says, every school has a zone of excellence and a zone of despair. And that's that 75% black. Okay? So in every school, what you find is that there are students who are taking hard courses, finding demanding faculty, spending lots of time studying, and showing substantial gains. I mean, average gains of 1 or 2 standard deviations over the first 2 or 4 years of college. Okay? And when we look at, if we take the top scorers, if we take the top gainers, if you wish, those who gain the most, we can find them in every school that we have. Okay? So every institution has students who are doing this. And every school has those on the other end, right, who are basically sliding by. They're finding easy courses, they're finding easy programs, they're finding ways to make it through college without a lot of effort, without showing substantial gains on this kind of a test. And so one thing I'm going to talk about it later in implications, but we think this is really important if you want to think about how to improve. Okay. One way is to, look next door to figure out what other schools are doing. But really the big work and lots of hard work is within institutions. Okay. It is doing assessment of your own institution, learning about your own students, figuring out which ones are showing gains, which ones are dedicated, which ones are studying, and being academically engaged, and which ones are not, and how can those who are not be moved along, and how can they be, kind of move in the direction of more engagement, more commitment, more learning. And so that variation is really within, and we really need to learn about our own institutions. Now, the 23% of across institutions, some of it is related to selectivity. Okay? So again, this graph is lacking all of its access labels, but it's basically the more and less selective institutions. So the black bar are the more selective schools, the gray bar are the less selective schools, and of course, there's a gap in 205. You would expect that, and then there's a slightly more gain over time in more selective schools, right? So students who attend more selective institutions show slightly higher gains over time than students who attend less selective institutions. Again, this is not really surprising. We see it with graduation rates, for example, right? We see it with a number of other outcomes that selectivity, right, tracks. And this is not net of students' own characteristics, right? There's something about selective schools that gives students a bit of an edge there. So I'm going to say a bit about how these students are faring in terms of how they're doing after college.
Ask a quick question here. What's
yes.
the size of your error bars on those graphs?
So you can't even see the graphs. So
I know, but how big, roughly?
yeah, so the standard deviations are quite large. Okay, the standard deviations on the CLA are quite large. And it is an essay. Okay, and so think about the appeal of multiple choice tests, right? Is that, well, there's an answer, that's it. The challenge of grading something like an essay is that there is lots of variation. There's a variation in terms of how students perform over time. So the standard deviations are quite large across all those. And think about also that the average gain is quite low. Okay, so the average gain in the first 2 years is only 0.18 standard deviations, right? So we're actually talking about very little effects of everything because we're trying to explain very little improvement, okay, and with a substantial amount of variation around that. Now, I could or should say that, CLA, there's been a number of questions about the reliability of the CLA. Because it is an essay-based test, and so there's a question about how do you score it and how do you capture these skills. Faculty members do it, there are multiple raters, and the inter-rater reliability is quite high. But you should also know, if you're interested in these kinds of questions, that there's another study at the same time. It's called the Wabash study of liberal arts education. It's at Wabash College, run by Charlie Blage. And that study uses CAP. Okay, it's a critical thinking test that's a multiple choice test. And you can say, well, how valid is that, right? So you're going to have different issues with different kinds of tests. There are no perfect tests. There's different tests that have different strengths, different weaknesses. Now, if you look at CAP, they have the 4 years of data, like we do. You get virtually identical results. Okay, so our gain over the whole 4 years of college is about 0.47 standard deviation, so about half a standard deviation. Theirs is a 0.44 on CAP. Okay, so they have different sample, different schools, different set of students, different measure, right? So we have a different measure that seems to be telling us the same things. And so while the different measures have different challenges, overall we seem to be getting similar results with those different measures. So how are they doing afterwards? Not too well, right? This is not a good time to be leaving college, entering the labor market. It's a very difficult time to be transitioning, and college graduates are feeling that. A third of them are back at school. Okay, they're going back to graduate school, and that's full time. There's a number of them who are taking courses, but a third of them are basically back in graduate school full time. Only half are actually working full time. A number of them are unemployed or having part-time jobs, right? It's a very difficult time to transition to the labor market. While they are in some ways struggling with labor market outcomes, they are leaving college indebted. Okay, we all know the patterns, right? So 2/3 of them are reporting having loans. Those who do have loans average about $26,000, right? So they are leaving college heavily indebted and not necessarily doing too well in the labor market. The best way, perhaps, to think about how they're doing in the labor market is figure about how many of them are back at home. Okay, so 24% of college graduates 2 years after college graduation are back living with their parents. Okay, it was about a third 1 year out. So when we surveyed them 1 year after college, a third of them were living back with their parents. This is 2 years out. And basically a quarter of them are back at home living with their families. So it's something to kind of think about in terms of transitions. And it's not only in a book and in our other work, we're also worried about a series of other issues. I mean, labor market transition is important. Part of what we do is preparing students to enter the labor market. But we also are doing lots of other things, and hopefully one thing that we're doing is preparing students for participation in democracy, right? For being democratic citizens, for participating and being engaged in a democratic process. And so we asked students a series of questions about that participation and involvement. The first question was just, do they read newspapers, online or in print? And so this is 2 years out. We have a third of college graduates, but this is the elite, okay, the college graduates of this country. A third of them say that they read newspapers, online or in print, monthly or never. Okay. That's important. Part of being an educated citizen, part of being a member of a democracy is kind of knowing what's happening in the world. And a third of them are not paying a lot of attention. And then the second question is even perhaps more troubling, because we asked them, do they discuss public affairs? Okay, in person, online, with colleagues, co-workers, friends, family, anybody. I mean, this should have been 100%, right? I mean, you can find somebody to talk to about something, right? Somehow. And we have 40% of the students who say that they only discuss public affairs and current events with anybody, basically monthly or never. Now, I'm drawing attention to these findings because I think this is as much of a failure of a higher education system as is, not teaching them how to do physics or how to, perform on a CLA and think critically and write well. That not preparing students for democratic citizenship is as important and something that we should think about much more carefully into the future. Now, it's not only that, well, there's these outcomes after college, but the important part is that these outcomes after college are associated with what students do during college. Okay? So this is just looking at their 209 CLA score, so the performance at the end of college on this test of critical thinking, comprehension, and writing. It tracks with whether they're back living at home. It tracks with unemployment rates. It tracks with civic participation rates as well. I just don't have the slide here. Similarly, we designed a slightly better measure. So as opposed to just looking at that kind of performance at the end, we put together a measure that looks at their engagement, the courses they're taking, how many hours they're studying, are they showing gains on the CLA over time. So it's kind of academic engagement and growth measure, and that tracks with kind of what they do after they leave college. And so we think that it's important, those outcomes are important in their own right, but they're also important in the sense that they do seem to track with what students do while they're in college. And so it's something to give us some pause in thinking about what exactly are we doing with them while they're with us, and how can we prepare them for the future from there onwards. So what do we do? This is a $1 million question now that there's all these bad news about how bad a state of higher education is. Well, one thing is once you hear all these findings, you may be inclined to argue for the federal accountability regime because this is so bad, and what do we do about it? We argue strongly against that. Okay, we spend lots of time in a book, in the beginning and in the end, talking about why we think that a federal accountability would be counterproductive. That the measures that we currently have are not ready. They're not designed. CLA was not designed as an accountability measure. Was never intended to be that. Okay, it was designed as a measure to improve classroom instruction. And similar issues. There are issues with other measures. We think federal accountability would have a number of unintended consequences, some of which we've seen in K through 12, right? And so we think that is not the strategy for improving higher education in this country. Now, we do think that there should be accountability, but it should be at the lower levels in the system. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment in terms of what we think that means. Now, while we argue against federal government getting involved in holding institutions accountable, we think there's some things they could do, right? One thing, they could provide incentives for institutions to innovate, right? Institutions that are trying to be creative, or trying to develop new programs, new centers, that are trying to transform undergraduate learning could receive resources and support from the federal government to basically incentivize innovation in this realm. The other thing is we think crucial I'm a social scientist by background, so I think needing to collect data is a crucial part of the process. We put this study together. It's not perfect. It's as well as we could do with the resources we had. But that there are no large national data sets that federal government collects over time, and that none of them include measures of learning in higher education, we think is just not acceptable, right? And we need that to be able to build the research infrastructure, right? We need to have large national representative data sets that track large numbers of students across large number of institutions over time, and can measure different aspects of student learning so that the social scientists can actually learn about, how much are students learning, where are they learning, how can we improve it? Okay, we need to build a much better research base on a national scale like we've done in K through 12. Now, when we think accountability should be at a lower level, right, we are primarily focused on institutions in our work. We're focused really on thinking about how institutions can take responsibility for transformation, and some like GW are obviously kind of thinking about that and trying to move in that direction. We talk a lot about institutional leadership. We think that is crucial. Okay? We think institutional leadership plays a key role in setting the tone for change, both in terms of both symbolically, right, having events, having discussions, having displays and support for teaching and learning, but also resource-wise, right? Where is the spending? How much is teaching and learning getting when it comes down to the budget times, right? So that we need to think carefully as leaders in terms of how much support, how much visibility, how much financial resources are available for teaching and learning, and assessment. Right? And I think that's a key part to that as well, is that we need to assess program quality and figure out places to improve, implement programs to facilitate change, and then measure how well we'll be able to do that. So we think institutional leadership plays a really crucial role in setting that. Now, at the same time, when it comes to coursework, we think that's a faculty area. That's an area of faculty expertise, and something that rightly so. But that's something that faculty need to really think carefully about. Okay? That faculty need to collectively take responsibility for the rigor across courses and programs. Now, and the key word there is collectively. Okay? And why? It's because, as you've seen this morning, an individual faculty member who becomes rigorous doesn't do too well. Okay? So our current, in the current system, right? Faculty are, if teaching matters at all, it's evaluated through student evaluations. Student evaluations in the current system at most institutions are satisfaction surveys. Okay? It's how much students like the course. Now, that often means how little did I had to do to get a very good grade. Okay? It's correlated with the grades. The evaluations are correlated with the grades students think they're going to get in a course, not necessarily with the learning they gain. And so, if a faculty becomes rigorous, what happens is the students, learn very quickly, ratemyprofessors.com, right, and other places, they learn very quickly that that's not a course to take because you know what, you're going to have to actually read and write in that course, and there's a course next door that you can totally slide by and do quite fine, right, and still get your degree from GW and do wonderfully, right, and the same thing holds for programs, right, I mean, if you have a program that kind of toes the line and says, we are going to really be strict, we're going to be demanding, we're going to be rigorous, students find other programs that are not like that. And what happens in the current system, right, that administrators shift the resources to those other programs because the resources currently move with enrollments. Okay? And so if students move, the resources move. And so the programs that aren't as rigorous attract more students and get more resources. Right? The incentive structure is just not set up very well, to say the least, in a current system. But so that's to highlight the issue of the fact that we think faculty need to take ownership and charge when it comes to the course rigor, but they have to do it collectively. Okay? We have to do it collectively at the program level and at an institutional level because we have to stand behind this together. And I think we can, because academic rigor is really what we are all about. And then the last point is about needing to think about how do we promote organizational culture that really focuses on academic engagement, not social engagement. We've spent the last few decades in higher education focusing on social engagement, right? How do we get students, socially engaged? And not that that's a bad thing. There are valuable things about being socially engaged, but the question is, what do we do to actually get students academically engaged and to improve on some of these outcomes that most of us really deeply care about? So thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, maybe a little less. I'll give people a chance to line up. I had one comment to make while we're waiting, which is that about the group versus individual study part, and it I think more or less confirms what you're saying in a very small way. A fellow named Uri Treisman, as you may know, at Berkeley in the early 1970s was trying to understand why black students virtually never took and passed math and science courses. And one of the things that he found was that Asian students studied together religiously and were doing very well. White students studied together some, and black students avoided studying together because they had learned in high school that it would drag them down. And the sort of the light that went on when I heard you talking was, oh, when the black students would have studied together, they wouldn't have been doing at all the same thing that the Asian students were doing. Because Treisman did document how the Asian students were benefiting from the study together, not just cognitively, but in learning about the sort of the lore of how you do well at Berkeley. They were sharing that not only among students in the same class, but from one cohort to another, and I guess you already know that.
Yeah, and Treisman has done a number of great experiments with specifically structured group work and how beneficial it can be. Particularly, he does his work in science, but that's very different from what studying with peers usually means, right? We usually just tell students to go work in groups, and that without guidance, and it's very difficult, right? I mean, how many faculty members are trained to really design groups effectively and to provide students with instruction of how to actually work effectively, as opposed to having the group that the night before somebody starts panicking and says, oh my God, this is due tomorrow, can somebody do it? Which is what more often happens. So there's really, I think the group work has lots of potential if it's really thought through and structured in a very specific way, but not often the way we currently do it.
Very good. Okay, first question.
Yes, I want to ask a question about today's students. Being one of those people in the 60s when something happened. When I was at college, we certainly had plenty of social engagement, and that correlates with what you were saying. But I don't think my peers worked anywhere near as hard as the students I have today. Now, some of this is sort of informal. I've always asked my students, how much time do you spend on the assignments I give you every week? And typically, I've had an answer over the years of something like 3 hours for every 1 hour in class. Fair enough. Well, in this age of Google, I can actually go to Google Docs and ask them very formally. And this is students self-reporting, just like yours. And when I ask, well, how much did you spend on last week's assignment? I get answers like 20 hours. Between 13 and 15, 22 to 24, 6 to 9, okay, 6 to 9 again, 6 to 9 again. But this is typical of what my students give me in their self-reporting. I just don't notice that today's students are any less committed than the students I was at college with. In fact, I think it's the other way around. What am I doing wrong?
Yeah. I don't know. This is about, whether individual experience can be used to generalize across the board. The national data seems pretty clear in terms of the number of hours studying. I don't know if GW is participating in
Our data is consistent with the national data.
Okay, so on average, GW students are not spending 20 hours on assignments, so you must be getting an incredible group of students that are self-selecting into
I will say,
class.
by the way, that in talking with individual students, it's not uncommon to hear students say, well, in general, I spend a couple hours a week per course studying, but for this particular course, a lot more, usually saying, well, it's in foreign languages, well, it's in science or mathematics, whatever it is. They see a reason for one particular course, and they spend a lot more time on that than they do generally, so that might be part of it. I will mention, I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Computer science, I'm sure that's what it was. I'll say before we get to the next question, there will be a faculty social that'll be beginning in maybe about 10 minutes on the second floor, and I'll remind you about that too when we get done. Yes.
I was very impressed by your statistics. I didn't realize that so many of our undergraduates qualified for higher political office. Not reading the papers,
No talking about public affairs.
Okay. But on a more serious note, I'm trained as a probabilist and statistician. What I remember vaguely when I taught regression analysis is that there's the Heisenberg effect. The more variables you add to the model, the less reliable, the more uncertainty there is associated with each factor. So how does that affect your statistical analysis of the data that you collect? And in particular, what does HLM stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hierarchical linear models. Because their students, their test scores embedded in the students who are embedded in schools, right? So there's kind of three levels of analysis. The patterns, different models have different set of variables in them. So the models that are HLM models have actually a very sparse set of controls in them for family background and prior test scores, prior associations. These gaps, right? So by race and ethnicities where you saw the HLM models, you'd see them in a row of data, and you'd see them when you control for things, and they are partly related to academic preparation, right? So they get smaller, but they're still there. And so in part, it depends on how many cases you have, how big is your sample, right? How many variables you can reliably put in the data set. And we are not even close to meeting the limit of not being able to make claims based on the variables.
But how statistically reliable are your estimates of those factor effects? I guess that's my question.
Well, which ones, I guess?
Well, you have all these factors, and can you distinguish between them? How do you decide whether they're statistically significant or not?
Well, statistical significance, we use the general, right? So there's two ways you can do it. One is you can look at a magnitude and say, how much of a difference does a particular factor make, either on its own or net of all of the other factors. The other way is you can say, statistically speaking, at a alpha 0.05, is this statistically significant? Is it significantly different from 0? Right? So all of the stuff that's significant, that we call significant, is at a 0.05 significance level. That's where the cutoff is statistically.
Okay.
Thank you. Oops. There you go.
So my first comment is just a counterpoint to what was brought up earlier about the number of hours studying. We have to remember that it's not just the number of hours, but it's whether you're doing quality studying. And I think there may well be a difference. This is anecdotal entirely, but I think there's probably a difference between the way that I used to study and the way that my students are currently studying. And they certainly think they're studying in a way that will result in an A, but they are definitely not doing so. And when I sit down and talk with them, I can help them to study better. But my real question builds on what I didn't get to ask this morning, and you've addressed some things that made me think along the very same lines. I think that you're quite right that we have to do this collectively if we are to become, I don't know if we want to say better teachers, but teach in a different way that helps our students better. Doing that takes an awful lot of time and commitment. Well, what are we rewarded for? Mm-hmm. We are rewarded for our research side. And until you make full professor, you really aren't able to drop those other commitments. So I'm not sure how we really do that well and rigorously and in a way that does not disadvantage those who do try to make that jump and go forward and get the bad evaluations from students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. We spend lots of time talking specifically about how incentives at higher education are not aligned with undergraduate learning. Okay? And that's at all the levels, right? So if you look at a faculty level, at most institutions, increasingly so, the faculty is rewarded for research, for publications, for grants, right? That's where the reward system is. Teaching is often not considered beyond a kind of a threshold, like, yeah, you have to get good enough, but don't worry after that. And how we evaluate is teaching evaluations, which are usually satisfaction surveys, right? So if you are rigorous, you actually get penalized in some ways. So faculty have very little, if any, incentive to actually make their courses rigorous. If you go up the hierarchy, right, administrators actually have very little incentive to focus on learning as well. Because administrators are often asked about the financial bottom line, about the ranking in a U.S. World News report, about the endowment, right, about the graduation rate, about the selectivity of the student body, right, how many students can we attract and how good are they. And so they have all of those goals they're trying to meet. And not to say that those are not important goals, but the question is, do they have anything at all to do with undergraduate learning? It's not clear that they do. And so the administrators are kind of focused on doing lots of things that are not focused on undergraduate learning. Faculty members, similarly so. Students can get very good grades with very little effort, right? So why should they be asking for more work? They're not going to do that. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how and this is why it's not like there's a bad actor, right? Like, it's the lazy faculty or the evil administrators. There is really no bad actor in a system. The problem is that a system is structured, the incentives are structured in such a way that everybody focuses attention on lots of things, but not undergraduate learning. And so the way we think you change that, you have to start changing the incentive system. Right? You have to start thinking about, research is important, but educating the next generation is as important. I mean, some of the greatest things we're ever going to accomplish. Not many of us are going to get Nobel Prizes, right? One thing that we're going to make an impact on is our students. And the question is for each institution to step back and start thinking about, did we kind of lose the balance? Where is that balance between doing the research and teaching? And how do we restore that balance? And how do we incentivize and give rewards to faculty?
I'll just throw in one thing here, which is that we have, we're beginning an effort to look at the incentive systems facing faculty. A faculty group is looking into that question. And going back to the argument that I made at the beginning, I think it's important to reward departments. Because if some of these learning outcomes can't be measured unless you're looking at a degree program or a sequence of courses, that means you're really talking more about at budget time in terms of aid with development efforts and so on. If you can reward the department, hopefully then that enlarges the pie, which then can benefit the faculty. But at a sort of more fundamental level, it's the collective effort that needs to be rewarded in order to then reward the individual effort too, sometimes. Yes.
You produced an interesting statistic that I think, if I remember correctly, said that 55% of college graduates over the 4 years show statistically significant increase in critical thinking. Am I remembering that correctly?
No, so over the 4 years, 36% show no significant gains.
I'm talking about who shows significant gains. So
yeah, but 36, so 45 is the first 2 years. You were talking about a whole 4 years.
The whole 4 years,
so
how many show
100 minus 36.
Okay, so in fact, the vast majority do show significant gain, which I find unbelievably laudable. My question is, do you have a comparison figure for, let's say, 1960?
Right, great question. They are showing gains, but the average gain is a half a standard deviation. I guess we can have a debate about whether that's a lot or a little. So our study is a one point in time. Obviously, we can tell you what the situation looks like today. Pasquarello and Terenzini have produced a study or in a volume that's called How College Affects Students, have compared all of the studies that have looked at critical thinking over time. Okay? And so they've looked at a number of studies in the 80s, number of studies today. Of course, when you're trying to compare across time, across different studies, there are a number of issues. But if you're kind of willing to pass that up for the moment, they argued that in the 1980s, student gains, freshman to senior, were on average 1 standard deviation. Today, the freshman to senior gain is about half a standard deviation. And that they get half a standard deviation from all of the studies that they've compiled and put together. We get a 0.47 standard deviations, so half a standard deviation. It's not firm, it's not definitive, but there's at least some indication that what we're seeing today is less than what was happening in the past.
Well, very good. I think we've reached the, one more question. We'll do one
I've got 2 brief questions that I'm curious about. By the way, congratulations. I actually read the book, but your presentation was so thorough. You don't have to go back to mine.
Don't say that.
Sorry about that.
No homework.
Okay, 2 questions. One, you didn't show any results where the grades were in there. Mm-hmm. And you must have run regressions and gotten a result of, do grades at all relate to gains in CLA? And the second question is, some of your schools must have had some really stinking results. And did you see any action on the part of those schools when you revealed this confidential information to them? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question is the correlation between the gains on the CLA and the grades is about 3-4. So it's modest, right? It suggests that we seem to reward with our grades critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing, but it's far from a perfect correlation. It's, grades don't reflect these sets of skills as well. And I mean, come to think about the overall grade distributions today. Okay? There was a study just released last week, right, that 45% of grades in U.S. four-year institutions are basically A and A minuses, right? So, we have a very compressed, like B is now what a C was, right? We have a very compressed distribution. And so it's the variation in grades today is much less. In terms of what schools, so many schools have been, that are in our study have been grappling with these issues for years before. They've been working with CLA and with the Council for Higher Education on assessing learning way before we came on the scene. I mean, we kind of joined the project midstream. And many of those institutions that are doing this are institutions that are interested, that want to know, that want to understand what's going on. And many of them have done a number of different things, trying to understand some of the patterns. Several of them are trying to figure out what's this studying with peers, why is it negative, what can we do about it? Some of them are revisiting the issue of incentives, the student evaluations. Some of them are spending more time talking to students and trying to figure out how do we change the culture among students so that the students see learning, not a credential, as what the college should be about, kind of trying to provide a counter narrative that college is not just about a credential, it's actually about a lot more. And so many of them are moving in a number of, they all meet, Babar study schools as well, usually meet once a year and share their results and share their challenges. And I think one thing that's observed is that how long it takes to produce these changes. Okay? Because there's so many moving pieces. The state that we are in currently is a product of a long process and many different actors and many different incentives. And so it's not something that can change overnight, but I think many institutions are trying to look inside, trying to figure out how to improve the learning of their students.
Well, very good. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed GW's first teaching day. Remember, upstairs for the faculty social.
It was a very nice one.